So for the unseen poetry, you get an hour and 15 minutes for the exam. It's quite a long time, and the exam board are quite clear that they want you to spend 20 minutes planning. The first mistake people make with this paper is they think, right, I'm going to start writing straight away and not plan at all, because I need to write as much as possible to be in with the chance of getting all the marks I possibly can. However, that is a mistake, because research shows that after you've written about 700 words, you've got all the marks you're ever going to get. So people who carry on writing tend just to be wasting their time. Worse than that, you might actually be waffling and writing in a way that is quite weak. So you'd be better off writing a little bit less, thinking harder, and making each point count for more. The other problem is that the more you try to write, the faster you try to write, guess what happens to your handwriting? It gets worse. And that is annoying for examiners to read. So my advice to you would be to spend the full 20 minutes planning, think very carefully about exactly what you want to say, choose the quotations that are most relevant to the question, and really prioritize the details. Don't fall into the trap of trying to talk about everything in equal detail. Focus on neat handwriting. So after that, we want you to be annotating the poem, thinking about particular words and phrases. And then a very brief plan can be helpful. You're given bullet points for tips about what you might like to explore. I would take the bullet points as instructions, basically. Write a paragraph on each bullet point. Roughly, they correspond to the beginning, middle, and end of the poem. We'll have a look at our example poem in a moment. Note here that they also advise that you draw a line across the page to mark different sections of the poem. They've given you bullet points for beginning, middle, and end. So really, you want to be finding beginning, middle, and end of the poem with your lines. Most people don't talk about structure, so it's a good idea to talk about structure if you can. Thinking about turning points. What are the ideas developed? How are they introduced? And then how do they conclude as well? The tone of the speaker's voice. Remember that the speaker in the poem isn't necessarily the poet. Instead, it's a persona adopted for the purpose of this particular poem. So the voice, the perspective you're being asked to write about, is a creation of the poet. And think about how that changes the tone or mood of the poem. Then 50 minutes. So about 2.5 sides of handwriting for most people, maybe 3 if you're really quick and have slightly large handwriting. And then 5 minutes checking your answer. Why would you ever need to check when spelling, punctuation and grammar aren't even on the mark scheme? What are we checking for? Well, it's areas where the analysis might be a little bit thin, where you could perhaps add in an extra insight, show a bit more sensitivity or detail. Also, if you've done silly things like misquoted the title of the poem, or called it a play or a novel, or made spelling mistakes when quoting the key words or phrases, although it's not in the mark scheme, guess what? The person marking it is still going to think you're a moron. So you need to check, and don't make yourself come across very poorly to the examiner. Right, so 20 minutes to plan, about 50 minutes to write, and then 5 minutes or so to check. Some people find it quite difficult to decide what to focus on when they're going through the poem. And one way to remind yourself in the panic of exam conditions of the types of things to look at is with this mnemonic. So I would note this down on the page next to the poem you've got. So stride stands for being able to take whatever they give you in your stride. And then, first of all, we need to get the basics. Who is speaking? About what? Where's the poem set? When is it? Nighttime, daytime, past, present, future? And why would anybody want to write a poem about this? And why would anybody want to read it? That's the deeper question. So they want you to have some understanding, I'm quoting from the examiner's report now, of why the particular text was written. What is its meaning or message? Most of the writing you have to comment on in exams wasn't written for boys to write about in exams. Instead, it was written because someone had something to say they thought was important. And most people reading it apart from some of the set poems which aren't particularly good, most people reading it are actually reading it for fun. So always remember why. What's the reason? The final sentence, line, or image can help you think about this because it normally sums up the meaning of the poem. So skip to the end. It's a bit like going to the end of a novel and finding out what happens. Plot spoiler. Go to the end of the poem and think about what it tells you about the climax or overall meaning of the poem. Most literature revolves around tension and conflict. There's an old saying, no problem, no poem. So people tend not to put pen to paper unless there's something bothering them they want to figure out or attack in some way. Even love poetry, which you might think hasn't got many tensions or conflicts in it, even if everything's going well in the relationship with the beloved, has to deal with the fact that eventually one of you is going to die. So love poetry also has the supreme conflict of love versus death. So look at how the tension or conflict might start, then where does it go next? How is it developed? And then how does it end? What conclusions are reached? And you've got to be prepared to realise that sometimes there are no easy answers. The ending can just be frustration or another question or a new revelation of tension or conflict. Next thing is, have a think about whether there's any repetition. This could be rhythm or rhyme, or it could just be words that are repeated or connotations that you think you can spot. Patterns. Semantic fields, they're called. So words that you can group as being similar in their meaning or connotations. We'll talk more about this later, but if you do spot that there's a rhyme scheme, don't just comment on the rhyme scheme in general. If you do spot there's a particular rhythm or meter, don't comment on the overall metrical scheme in general. You're much better to say the most effective rhyme is and choose one and give your reasons. A particularly significant rhyme is. A particularly effective metrical stress is. So go for insight into individual details. We want particular cases and in particular effects. Next one, and I would say that the bulk of your marks come from this. This is basically any way in which the writer appeals to your five senses. Poetry is about making things concrete, appealing to the senses. It's not really about abstract ideas. They have to be embodied through sensory detail. So how do we add emotion to information? How does the writer work on our imaginations? That's the question to answer. So for imagery, ask yourself sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, the five senses. Sight, sound, smell, touch, taste. And try and find what details you think are relevant for each. Then we've got different sentence lengths. People often forget that poems are written in sentences, and it's quite a good idea to watch what the writer does with them. What is the shortest sentence? What is the longest one? Can you spot any particular moments in the poem where the sentences vary in length or style? How does he begin sentences? Is it always with the subject? Or sometimes is the syntax altered for special effects? And then at the end, you're much better off to conclude by finding a detail or phrase that best sums up the impact of the poem on you, rather than just saying a summary of what you've already said. So ask yourself, is there one word or phrase that best sums up the mood or atmosphere of the poem? Often, the title is quite a good clue for this, because it's likely that the poet has written about something, especially if it's an object from nature, like a tree or a plant or an animal or something like that. It's being used in the poem because it represents certain ideas for the poet. And that is the case with the poem we're about to look at. I don't think that you need to have a paragraph on each of these in this order as your essay plan. I wouldn't do that. I would just follow the bullet points that they give you and go through the poem chronologically. But despite that, this is a very useful way to annotate poems. So this is how to annotate poems and find details to talk about. When you actually come to write the essay, just use the bullet points they give you. But this will give you a nice list of things to tick off as you go through the course of your essay. Your introduction and conclusion, though, when you actually write the essay probably will just give the situation in the introduction and probably the tension as well. And the conclusion will be the evaluation. But for these details here, rhythm, imagery, different sentence lengths, you can mix those points up in the paragraphs whenever you need to in the essay. So let's have a look at this question on Ted Hughes's poem, The Jaguar. You'll always get 3 bullet points. 3 bullet points to help you with the question. In this case, we need to underline what details we think are relevant. So in the first bullet point, it's mainly about the other animals. Second bullet point, middle of the poem, it's what makes the jaguar different. And then the third bullet point always directs you to the end of the poem. And in this case, we've got final 2 stanzas and what makes them so impactful. What makes the final 2 stanzas so impactful? Right, now we know what we need to look at, we go through and we have to choose some details that could be relevant. So annotate your copy of the poem as I talk you through some of the ways in which I approached it. First thing I've done is given my 3 lines showing the rough structural divisions of the poem. So the way I've done this is by looking for words that show me there are turning points or changes of direction. So the first 2 stanzas describe the other animals in the zoo. Then I noticed that the beginning of the 3rd stanza had but who runs like these past the rest arrives at a cage where the crowd stands, stares mesmerized as a child at a dream at a jaguar. So stanza 3 is when the jaguar enters the poem. And unsurprisingly, there seems to be a turning point there with but. So my line here marks the division between basically first and second bullet point in the question. Now I have to think about a division between second and third. So I went through and then found that just towards the end of the penultimate stanza, we've got, but there's no cage to him. So the jaguar was caged. That's what the second section is about largely. But we changed direction because it seems like although he's physically trapped, he's mentally free. So the second but here gave me my 3rd division for the poem. So I've got my 2nd line in here. So once I've used my lines across the page, and remember that is what they said to do in the tips from the exam board, we now have a rough sense of which parts of the poem correspond to which bullet points.
So it is in chronological order in a way. Even though you said that you don't need to put them in that order, it is kind of in chronological order.
Yeah, but remember I said that the stride plan isn't really a way to write an essay, it's a way to annotate a poem. So we don't need to write it according to the stride plan, we just annotate according to that. When it comes to the poem, you're best off following chronologically, because that's what the bullet points do. Remember, the bullet points aren't actually tips. They're basically passive-aggressive instructions. You might like to consider, is how they normally phrase it, it actually means if you want a good mark, follow these instructions. So just do what they say.
And they are the topic sentences.
Yeah, but you can't just rehash them with the exact words. Instead, you've got to add some sort of insight. So what theme or idea about the other animals do you want to talk about in your paragraph? What theme or idea about how the jaguar is different do you want to use? And then also, for the final 2 stanzas, what impression do you get? So now we want to find about 3 to 4 quotations that we think are most important for each one of the 3 sections of the poem. To begin with, I'm just going to be going through, picking out some of the interesting words and phrases like they said to do. So first of all, I'm just looking at some of the verbs that I think are important. So the way the apes yawn, for example, suggests perhaps tiredness, but also laziness. The idea that they're adoring their fleas as well might add to that negative impression we get of them, suggesting that they're kind of complacent or selfish or self-absorbed. The parrots strut, a verb that suggests that they're attention-seeking or showy. And then this is developed by the simile comparing them to cheap tarts. Then we get the tiger and lion, who are fatigued with indolence and lie still as the sun. So yawning and lying for some of the animals. Neither of these seems particularly energetic or impressive. The parrots, who shriek and strut, do seem more energetic, but there seems to be something attention-grabbing or superficial or hollow about it. So none of the animals so far seems to be being presented in a way that makes them particularly appealing. The boa constrictor's coil is a fossil. That's an interesting image. So it seems so still that it's fossilized, like it's in a kind of living death. I might be linking that to how the tiger and lion lie still as the sun. So there's a real lack of energy and excitement in most of the animals. The parrots are an exception, but their activity seems to be more irritating than anything else. Cage after cage seems empty or stinks of sleepers from the breathing straw. Yep.
So like the fact that it's sort of like the breathing straw, it seems like the straw does more than the animals themselves.
Yeah, excellent. That's an interesting image, isn't it? What this means is that the animals are asleep, but they're so still you can barely see them. And it's like the straw itself is all there is in the cage. Breathing straw. So it's the image you just explained. So they're so still that when you look in, it's hard to see the animals, but the straw that they're asleep on seems like it's breathing. Stinks might go well with strut and shriek and cheap tarts as another way of conveying this slightly distasteful impression that the animals have on the visitors to the zoo. It seems actually that they're not even alive at all, as if they're just paintings on a nursery wall. They're that static. And in general, you can see we've got quite short sentences for the first section as well. If we look at the first one line to sun. Then we've got one which is 2 lines, from parrots to nut, then fatigued to sun. When you spot a full stop in the middle of a line, it's called a medial caesura. Sometimes this can have the effect of slowing down the poem even more. Then just a line and a half, from boa constrictor's coil to fossil. Then 2 lines, then 1 line. So far, beginning of the poem, a sense of, broadly speaking, stillness or apathy or laziness with quite short sentences too.
So I thought short sentences emphasise vividness, with its fast flow.
Well, you've got to think about the context. So it would be too much of a generalization to say that short sentences always make things fast flowing. Instead, here, it's about a few details, none of which is particularly developed because there's not a lot going on. Now what happens in section 2 is that we start to see a change in the tone. And unsurprisingly, the sentences now change as well. So one whole stanza there, and then halfway into the second one. And then the next sentence goes from not in boredom all the way to the end of the poem. Penultimate line, heal, then come. So for this one, we immediately get a far longer sentence than we had in the first section of the poem. Perhaps this is to do with the rush of energy that the jaguar represents. So now the sentences flow over the very short lengths they were at before. Unsurprisingly, some of the language about the jaguar reflects that. So the crowd are running. Then, when they arrive at the jaguar, they're static. And the jaguar himself is hurrying enraged after the drills of his eyes on a short, fierce fuse. So a good answer would be commenting on the sudden change in sentence length. Also contrasting the language here to do with pace and energy with the more static language of the first section. We're thinking about how the jaguar is made different from the other animals. Compared to the other animals, there's something extremely exciting about the jaguar as well. Stands, stares, mesmerized as a list of 3 details telling us about the impact he has, perhaps gets stronger and stronger. So they're standing still watching, but they're not just watching, they're staring, like their attention is fixated. And then mesmerized is even stronger than stares. It's like they've fallen under a kind of spell. the jaguar has a hypnotic power. And then even stronger than mesmerized, the crowd, which comprises not only children but adults too, stares as a child at a dream. So that simile there is a really important image of how the jaguar is portrayed to us. Whenever you see a metaphor or simile, try to give a couple of reasons why it's important. So as a dream, does this suggest there's something fantastical about the jaguar, something larger than life? It's almost surreally vivid, nightmarish perhaps. Hurrying needs to be contrasted with the fossilized stillness of the boa constrictor, the tiger and lion that are fatigued with indolence.
What is indolence?
Anyone have a go at defining indolence yet?
Inactivity and lethargy.
Good. So it's describing them physically, but also it implies something, almost personifying them, about them morally. To be indolent is to be slothful or lazy in a way that reveals something about your character. If you can, it's important to comment on the effect of run-on lines. So some sentences stop where lines stop, others run over lines and stop on the next line. So through prison darkness after the drills of his eyes, grammatically could have been a full stop there, but instead the sentence runs over not only a line but a stanza as well. To on a short fierce fuse. So think about the effect of the run-on line there. The examiner's report says if you can, look at the syntax of individual sentences is the most important skill you can show off, particularly with run-on lines. So you could argue here that what this adds, after the drills of his eyes on a short fierce fuse, is that this line becomes a kind of short fierce fuse because of the way it's been set out. So there's a bit of suspense, tension here, after the drills of his eyes on a short fierce fuse. And then, dramatic pause. Not in boredom. So there's a contrast between why you imagine he might be running, hurrying, because he's frustrated and bored. But then the poem again just alters direction slightly.
What's the point of, in the second line, the parrot shrieking and the thing on fire? That's quite vivid, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I think the parrots seem irritating in the first section. So if you're on fire, shrieking, you're in a lot of pain, making lots and lots of noise. The parrots so far, we've heard that they strut like cheap tarts and they want to get attention from the strollers to try and get some nuts thrown to them. And screaming like they're on fire, even though they're not, just shows how much noise they're making. After the fact that he's not in boredom, we then start to get some other details about him that show that he's different from the others. The parrots were described as shrieking like they're on fire. The jaguar, though, his eye is satisfied to be blind in fire by the bang of blood in the brain, deaf the ear. So think what the eye symbolises about him. If you ever stared into a cat's eye, think about the intensity of it, exactly. And there's something about the eye here that symbolises the jaguar as a whole. So the eye sums him up here, and it's satisfied to be blind in fire. What's the fire? It's definitely a metaphor of some sort. What does it represent? His untamed energy, the fact that the cage can't defeat his spirit. Could argue that. We could also argue it's something about perhaps not just the fact that he is unbeaten by the cage, but doesn't mind feeling angry about it. There's a kind of rage here, rather than boredom. Then we get some sound effects here that show off the sense of intensity and power that he has. Bang, blood, brain, bars. So his eye is blind in fire, and then his ear is deafened by the bang of blood in his own brain. Don't know if you've ever been running or playing sport or whatever, and you can hear the blood beating in your own ears if you've gone for a hard sprint. So the image here is that the jaguar is completely consumed by the fire in his own eyes and the beating blood in his own brain and ears. So we've got hurrying, enraged. We've also got here spinning from the bars. Remember to contrast these verbs for the jaguar with the verbs and images for the animals in the first section of the poem. Everything is about pace, aggression, anger. You might also be thinking about drills as an image. So the function of a drill is to bore through something, but it also suggests perhaps the idea that its eyes are piercing and perhaps dangerous. So he's caged, but there's no cage to him. That's an interesting tension, isn't it? And we're thinking about what that might represent, why this means the animal is interesting to the poet. Conflict between being physically captured but mentally free. And the jaguar is now compared to a visionary. So a visionary is like a hermit or a religious figure who is able, despite being confined to a small space physically, to transcend that. The colon after cell means that his stride, his wildernesses of freedom, completes that idea that he's a visionary. So he seems trapped, but actually as he strides around the cage, he's enjoying not only freedom, but wildernesses of freedom. So it's as if the physical containment has almost no effect on him. His mind is the same as it would have been in the wild. And in fact, the whole world seems to roll under the long thrust of his heel. So that is an image of the jaguar being in command or domineering. It's like the globe spins when he moves on it. And then dramatic one-line final sentence: over the cage floor, the horizons come. Remember we said that it's often a good idea to choose an image from the last line of the poem to sum up your overall impression of it. So I would be contrasting cage, which is to do with not having very broad horizons at all, with the fact that the horizons are coming over the cage. So physically trapped, but spiritually unbeaten. So if we're asking ourselves what the jaguar might symbolize now, it's probably about having an indefatigable spirit. So having gone through the whole poem and made some notes then, what we now need to do is come back to the question and think about what we're going to say in the introduction as our overall impression of the main meaning or message of the poem, perhaps quoting from the end. So what I'd be saying first of all is that the jaguar is made vivid mainly because despite being physically caged, he seems spiritually or mentally free. The image from the end of the poem, portraying him as a visionary, enjoying wildernesses of freedom, conveys this most powerfully. We also need to think of a theme or idea for each topic sentence. So the other animals seem broken by captivity. Very still, very lethargic, indolent. The parrots do seem to have an energy, but it's a kind of desperate, attention-seeking, irritating energy.
Sure, should the conclusion take, does it have to be a quotation from the end?
It can be a quotation from anywhere that you think best sums up the mood of the poem. Second bullet point, I would be saying that the jaguar is similar in that he's trapped, but he's different in that he seems undefeated by captivity. He still seems wild. And then the final two stanzas are so impactful because they develop the metaphor of the jaguar as a symbol of spiritual freedom. Sometimes it's quite useful to have a top 10 words checklist for poems, top 10 words checklist. If you've got 10 quotations and you say 2 things about each one, then you've got 20 things to say, and you've got a good chance of getting into the top band on the mark scheme. So quick rundown of some words you might include. You don't have to have these ones, but you might find them useful. I would definitely have yawn, the comparison of the parrots to cheap tarts, indolence for the tiger and the lion, the fossil image, the nursery wall painting. I'd be talking about the fact that we've got short sentences for the first section of the poem. I'd also have stands, stares, mesmerized, showing how the jaguar's impact becomes stronger and stronger the more they look at him. He reduces them to like children in a dream. The eyes are like drills. The short fuse suggests that perhaps there's an explosion of some sort coming soon. And then you might be comparing the fire imagery for the jaguar's eye to the fire that makes the parrot shriek in the beginning, contrasting their reactions. The jaguar is satisfied in fire. And then you'd want the image of the horizons coming over the cage floor and his heel seeming to control the world itself.